ministers will review the implementation of the agreements reached by the leaders of the association, as well as outline further steps to develop strategic partnership in the context of preparation for the 17th BRICS summit, which will also take place in Brazil on July 6th and 7th. Within the upcoming ministerial meeting, there will be a session with the participation of the BRICS partner member states foreign ministers with the theme of the role of the Global South in strengthening multilateralism. I would like to recall that the decision to establish the category of partners was taken at the BRICS summit in October of last year in Kazan under Russia's chairmanship. And on the 30th of April, Sergei Lavrov, within his visit to the Latin American region, will visit the Dominican Republic. This year we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations with this country. The visit is also timed to coincide with the opening of the embassy of the Russian Federation in the Dominican Republic. There are plans for meetings with the president of this country, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. During the talks with the Dominican partners, we're expected to discuss the prospects for the development of bilateral cooperation, including the intensification of political dialogue, building up cooperation in trade and economic investment, tourism, cultural and humanitarian areas, as well as strengthening the legal framework. Sides will also consider topical issues on the global and regional agenda. Tomorrow, on April 25th, in the Alexandrovsky Garden, there will be a solemn ceremony of laying flowers and wreaths at the tomb of the unknown soldiers with the participation of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps accredited in Moscow. This will be one of the central events organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Foreign Diplomats in the year of celebration of the 80th anniversary in the victory in the Great Patriotic War. This commemorative action will unite representatives of all regions of the globe and show that despite the attempts to rewrite history, the memory of the events of those years is carefully preserved and cherished throughout the world. Now for the current agenda, the situation around Ukraine. Every day, every hour, every second, it becomes more and more clear to us the lack of commitment on the part of the Zelensky regime following the sabotage of the 30-day moratorium on strikes on energy infrastructure facilities, which we have repeatedly talked about during our briefings, proving it with facts. And I would like to recall that the Ukrainian armed forces have violated this moratorium 136 times, and the Kyiv regime also disrupted the 30-hour Easter truce announced by the Russian president. Let me recall Easter, the holy day. First, Zelensky rejected this proposal of the Russian side on the truce during Easter celebration, and then, probably under the pressure from his Western curators, who continue to supply him arms, that at least for show it would be good to show constraint. He supported this proposal, but only in words. According to the Russian Defense Ministry data, over 30 hours, 4,900 violations were recorded. In addition to thousands of artillery shellings, they used 90 drones, fired missiles from the American multiple rocket launcher system HIMARS on the Kursk region. It seems that he's doing it on purpose, and he's trying to put the US under fire using their own arms during the Easter celebrations. The targeted attacks on Russian civilian objects in the Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, and Kherson regions, the DPR, Crimea, were cynical. After the targeted strikes by neo-bandits in the village of Nechaevka in Belgorod region, a woman and two minor girls were wounded. Donetsk and Gorlovka were shelled, including with cluster shells of 155mm caliber. 3 civilians were wounded. All these was accompanied by demonic remarks in Ukrainian social media. Just take a look. On the morning of April 20th this year, as a result of one of the AFU strikes, a fire broke out. And by the conspirators of the Kyiv regime's crimes was referred to as the descent of the blessed fire. The Russian army has faithfully observed the Easter truce. Numerous facts of terrorism on the part of the AFU militants on the Easter holiday, which is celebrated by the world's Christians, have once again demonstrated Zelensky's complete lack of commitment and his lack of clear conscience. They've lost all control. These gangs of mercenaries, they don't even understand who they answer to anymore. And they aim to fully escalate this war. And the picture of the obscurantism reigning in Ukraine was complemented by the footage of men fleeing from the holy service, from the visiting Dudalov's military commissars, and all of this is taking place in Ukraine. Seized by the schismatics, half-empty churches of the canonical church. This is the real picture of Easter in Ukraine 2025. I'd like to recall that the militants in those churches, where they try to seize the last men in Ukraine and to drag them not just to the fighting fields but to the graves, they also consecrated the unmanned aerial vehicles, as well as receiving blessings for crimes against civilians. I believe this is a complex picture. It's not just one side of it that doesn't coincide with the full picture. It's all the same. On the other crimes of the Kyiv regime, Ukrainians, even outside the Easter truce, continued their targeted hunting of civilians in Russian regions, including women and children. In Belgorod region on April 16th, in the village of Malomihailovka, because of the explosion of a Kolokolchik mine planted by the Bendrovites, a 10-year-old boy was killed. On April 21st this year, in the Dolgo village, as a result of a drone attack on a residential house, a woman was wounded and a civilian was injured by a drone. On April 22nd this year, in Kasilova village, a UAV attacked a car, injuring a married couple, their 16-year-old daughter and 19-year-old son. On April 16th this year, in Donetsk, after a drone attack, a girl born in 2017 was injured. And in Yelenovka settlement, an employee of the federal state enterprise Novorossiya Railways was injured on April 18th this year. In the Volodarskaya settlement, a boy born in 2015 was killed. In Gorlovka, in the cemetery, due to the detonation of an explosive object, a man was killed. On April 22nd, 7 more residents of the DPR were injured, including a 14-year-old girl. In the Bryansk region, on April 17th, the Ukrainian armed forces shelled the Orthodox Church chapel in the village of Zernovo, completely destroying it. Of course, what kind of Easter truce could we be talking about for Zelensky? It's as if the clock has stricken for the evil forces. On April 18th this year, 2 self-defense fighters were killed as a result of a UAV dropping an explosive device. And as a result of attacks by a few drones, including attacks on civilian vehicles, 3 civilians were wounded. Evidence was obtained on the shooting by AFU fighters of civilians in the town of Krasnogorovka, DPR, before its liberation by the Russian military in September 2024. A criminal case was opened over the murder of AFU fighters in January 2025 of 3 family members of a resident of the farm of Kolmakov, Kursk region. Russian military investigators have identified Ukrainian AFU commanders involved in the massive drone attack on Kursk on April 15 this year. This is the commander of the 14th Separate Regiment of Unmanned Aerial Systems, Dmitry Bondarovich, commander of the 383rd Separate Brigade of Unmanned Aerial Systems of the Air Force, Andrei Zany, and his deputy Vitaly Zindzuk. They are suspected of committing the aforementioned terrorist act, and of course they will have to pay for all the aforementioned crimes. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for their war and other crimes. A court of the DPR has convicted in person the fighters from the neo-Nazi Azov unit, an organization recognized as terrorist and extremist and banned in Russia. So, a court order was given to Andrei Yaroshnitsky and Dmitry Gnatenko. The investigation established that in March 2022, in Mariupol, they together with their fellow soldiers, Andrei Barshek and Yuri Dmitriev, in fulfillment of an illegal order of the command, fired at least 200 shots from a mortar at a granary where civilians were hiding, and they were aware of that. As a result, one person was wounded. Ruchka and Yaroshnevsky each received 24 years in a strict regime colony. Ignatenko 23 years and 9 months. Earlier, Barsky and Dmitriev were sentenced in absentia to 24 and 24 and a half years of imprisonment and were put on the international wanted list. Earlier detained by Russian servicemen, Alexander Chmyl was sentenced to 16 years in prison for committing acts of terrorism. On August 27, 2024, in the village of Zhurovly, Kursk region, he mined roads, prevented the evacuation of civilians, and carried out acts of intimidation with the use of weapons. 15 years in prison were given to Ukrainian militant Sergei Yermeyev, who was captured in September 2024. He repeatedly opened fire on civilians and Russian servicemen near the village of Vetrino in Kursk region, as well as prevented the evacuation of residents and mined roads. 15 to 16 years in prison for committing terrorist acts were given to the fighters of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Sergei Safronov, Yaroslav Mazur, Dmitry Gorenko, and Kirill Komarov. In August 2024, they illegally entered Russia in armored personal carriers and fired on our military and local residents, as well as mined roads. All four were detained by Russian servicemen. 14 and 14 and a half years in prison in absentia were given to British and Georgian mercenaries Joseph Philip MacDonald and Gia Saliani, and both are on the international wanted list. The criminal case of the previously detained on the territory of the LPR, a mercenary from Australia, Sir Oscar Charles Augustus Jenkins. And what has this been supported by the Western aid? The West continues military and financial pumping on Kyiv. The nomenclature of weapons which Germany is going to supply to the Ukrainian armed forces within the framework of its recently announced package worth 3 billion euros. All this considering the catastrophic economic situation in Germany. We're talking about 300 guided missiles, 100 radars, 15 Leopard tanks, 300 reconnaissance UAVs, 25 infantry fighting vehicles, 14 artillery pieces. And on top of all of that, about 100,000 artillery shells. Sweden is also increasing its military aid to Ukraine, the 19th and largest range of $1.6 billion since February 2022 was announced. Recently, it became apparent that Sweden had started transferring 2 reconnaissance planes ASC-890 that it has in stock. One of them has allegedly already arrived in the country and made test flights over Lvov region on April 21st, 22nd this year. As far as we can judge, it is meant to be used in combination with F-16 fighters. Norway plans to increase military aid to Kyiv this year by $4.6 billion. to $7.8 billion. The money will be used to purchase air defense equipment, artillery shells, UAVs, to strengthen Ukraine's military-industrial complex and build up its naval capabilities. Within the framework of the so-called coalition of capabilities led by Oslo and London, the Danish government is preparing to allocate in 2025-2026 a 25th package of aid worth $960 million. $216 million for Ukraine military needs by the end of this year will be supplied by Lithuania. They've tried to gather everything they could. In its turn, the Latvian Defense Ministry is going to transfer several hundreds of reconnaissance UAVs worth 20 million euros in the near future. All these clearly testifies to the hopeless desire of the European hawks to help Kyiv change the situation on the ground in its favor. They're at a dead end with their dialects, but doing something different means recognizing the defeat of the war ideologies, and they're frightened by the obvious prospect of a Russian victory. In order to avoid such a scenario, they encouraged the Zelensky regime to continue fighting regardless of casualties, because it's the Ukrainian citizens who are dying. And it's not just Oslo, London, Tallinn, Riga, Paris, Rome, Madrid who have no care for them. It's their own president who doesn't care about them at all. And the Kyiv regime diplomacy has woken up. We've paid attention to the next escapades of the scandalously famous ex-ambassador of Ukraine in Berlin. He was already kicked out, and now he is a permanent representative in the UN, Andriy Melnik. And despite moving to New York, he continues to provide business advice to the future German government on the scale of assistance to Kyiv. On April 19th this year, in an interview with the German newspaper, he stated that Zelensky's regime is capable of waging war until 2029 if Germany transfers to the AFU 30% of its military equipment, including long-range Taurus missiles. He also expects the legislators to provide annual allocation of 0.5% of the German GDP, worth about 86 billion euros. And the EU with the G7, according to Ukrainian permanent representative, allocate about 550 billion euros, confiscate Russian assets, and provide Kyiv with security guarantees, accession to NATO and the EU, and so on. You see, perhaps he should see a doctor, not the UN, about this. But this is great characteristics and the clear picture of what is taking place on Bankovaya. They understand perfectly that they should just intimidate the Western curators with something and the money will flow. So this is the tactics that they are using here. Here's why the hunger of the Bankova increases to the West's military and financial assistance. With their dream of defeating Russia on the battlefield, now they don't even recall the battlefield. Just take a look at what is taking place of the world diplomacy. On April 23rd, the second round of consultations of US representatives with their British, French and German counterparts, as well as a delegation from Kyiv on the Ukrainian crisis in London. Actually, they reported that these were supposed to be consultations not just on the crisis, but on its resolution. According to Western media reports, they were supposed to discuss a certain plan, a 7-point plan, designed to open the way to a peaceful settlement. The day before, Zelensky speaking frankly, just refused to make any concessions, stating that on legal non-recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, and he demonstratively expressed his desire to negotiate only a ceasefire, and only on his own terms. This approach by Kyiv's regime once again demonstrated its irresponsibility to reach an agreement, its lack of commitment, desire to continue fighting without regard for any casualties until the last Ukrainians.
Чего им считать?
Why should they? Why should they count the victims? Zelensky doesn't consider his own citizens as humans. We've seen it on the example of the peoples of Donbass, and now same logic is applied to their own citizens. It's not his money, he's never earned it. This money is supplied to him in exchange for natural resources of Ukraine and the lands of Ukraine. But again, it's not Zelensky who created these lands. After such comments, Marco Rubio and Stephen Witkoff were forced to cancel their participation in the meeting. Head of the Foreign Office of the UK, as well as foreign ministers of Germany and France, followed suit. As a matter of fact, Zelensky derailed the London round of consultations, which testified to the Kyiv's intention to derail the peace process at any price. It's exactly what they did with the Minsk agreement. It's exactly what they did with the 30-day moratorium on strikes against energy infrastructure. That's how they derailed peace talks in spring 2022, and that's how they undermined the Easter truce. Now let's turn to the Western media. They continue to publish materials about what's really happening in Ukraine. On the 16th of April, The Economist concluded that monopolization of power by Zelensky is happening in Ukraine. Well, it's better too late than never. They stress that Zelensky, who usurped power, and his assistants don't want to share power neither with the government nor with the parliament. Now I would like to ask Western journalists who suddenly have some suspicions, and previously, what do you think his plans were? It was not about democracy that he agreed with Biden. When Biden traveled to Ukraine and led sessions of the government, none of Western journalists even asked a question about democracy and the rule of law. They didn't want to know what sort of example the US Democrats were showing to the Ukrainians. Was it not a beginning of usurping the power in Ukraine? Wasn't it a mocking of law? No, the Western journalists applauded back then. It was a great picture according to them. They also applauded to the way the war was usurped during the Maidan events. They applauded when local authorities' premises were destructed by those who the West financed. All of this led to an anti-constitutional coup d'etat. And now, all of a sudden, Western journalists come to their senses and ask themselves why the power is being usurped by Zelensky. Why don't they find a single fact of how democracy is applied in Ukraine? Why don't they find a single evidence of how rule of law was supported with the help of the West? Now, Western media stress that those who demonstrate independence and have major support of the population, have direct contact to Western officials, were either fired by Zelensky and his assistants, or their power was reduced. And what was the situation before, when the legitimate president of Ukraine, well, remember the Maidan events, the elected president was outlawed, and it was done upon insistence of the West, and it was jubilated by the Western media, and it was to make sure that Yushchenko comes to power during the third round of elections. And now remember the second round of Maidan, which was the last one for Ukraine and its then borders. Remember how the crowd, paid by the Western money, demanded that the legitimately elected president and legitimately elected power and law enforcement agencies are stopped. Where were the Western journalists back then? We see that Zelensky, who is losing power, tries to defend his power and cleans the political field from potential competitors. His office plans to pass through Verkhovna Rada a bill that would limit the power of city mayors to 2 cadences, which may dismiss the mayors of Kyiv, Odessa, Dnepropetrovsk and other major cities. Thus, the Zelensky regime tries to establish total control over local authorities, preparing himself for possible political upheaval. I would like to remind those in Ukraine who is still capable of reasoning, remember how negotiators visited Ukraine. What happened to the Ukrainian negotiators? Some of them were simply killed. The president's office decided to prolong the mobilization in Ukraine until the 7th of August. And in order to fuel Russophobia, Zelensky declared another set of sanctions against 18 entities and 130 physical persons of Russia. Who needs it? How can it help him or Ukrainian citizens in addressing their problems? They are forced to present some sort of activities and pretend to keep themselves busy. Later, I will say who should be on that list, but now I'll say who was included on that list for unclear reasons. I take, for example, Alexander Solotkov or Arina Sharapova or Andrei Norkin or Iskander Husamov. And talking about entities, it is the International Civic Movement, Other Ukraine, or Tavria TV broadcaster. But it wasn't enough for Zelensky. On the 18th of April, he imposed restrictions against 20 more figures of domestic culture and sports. Now artist Yuri Kuklachev is under sanctions, as well as singers Yaroslav Dronov, Nikolai Rustogorev, Alexander Rosenbaum, Garik Sukachev, and actors such as Alexander Pankratov-Chorny, Yevgeny Mironov, Irina Apeximova, Oskar Kuchera, Vitaly Gogunsky, Nikita Jigorda are under sanctions, as well as head of the Russian Academy of Ballet, Nikolai Tsiskaridze, and ballet star Sergei Polunin, a raper, athletes, boxers, gymnasts. On that same day, Zelensky imposed sanctions against 39 Russian scientists and business people. Those are the people who particularly stand in the way of Zelensky's office. Who should be on top of the list of those who really threaten the peoples of Ukraine? On top of that list should be Zelensky himself. He is who is truly destroying and eliminating the peoples of Ukraine. Commenting the sanctions by Zelensky, Alexander Rosenbaum called them a manifestation of a strike of allergy against everything that is Russian. Ukraine presidential office tries to ban the Russian language and culture and destroy and eliminate the Russian world. That's what they are trying to do. But they fail in doing so because the Russian language is used, Russian books are read, Russian films are watched. The president's office is simply afraid by the fact that the Russian language is used increasingly often in Ukraine. Our songs and our music is listened to and is sung increasingly often. They watch films shot in Russia. What do they fear in Ukraine? That people start coming to their senses? Well, but you, Mr. Zelensky, you kill them, so what do you fear more? That people come to their senses, or that you are out of people because they are under life threat in Ukraine? And in the year when we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the great victory, Zelensky builds up his efforts to fight against the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. They continue to fight monuments. Yesterday, on the 23rd of April, there were reports about a destruction in Lvov on the Mars field of a mass grave of Soviet soldiers who fell during the liberation of that very city from German fascists in July 1944. That mass grave was where remains of over than 1,500 soldiers and officers of the Red Army rested. I think it was the top of immorality. What can be next? Officially, the Lvov authorities called these blasphemous actions, I quote, the work on exhumation. It was decided to carry out those works with an excavator and other heavy equipment. We feel the signature, the style of Banderovites. They couldn't win on the battlefield, but they invented a mean way to take revenge on our fighters of
In July 2024, on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Washington, the ice-pact icebreaker collaboration was signed between Canada, the US, and Finland. They developed the coalition potential of the monitoring of the situation in the region with special stress to watching the Russian Northern Fleet. They plan to open 8 radio location stations on the territory of Norway. There's greater scale and number of exercises of the alliance and their member states with scenarios not only of defensive but of offensive character as well. And Russia is openly called an enemy. In 2024, more than 1,000 exercises took place. They took place from January through June 2024, and Steadfast Defender 2024 became the largest since the Cold War. In a number of exercises united by one aim, which is to counter an equal enemy in the eastern wing. With firing and bombing, about 90,000 people were involved. They took place on the territories, waters, and airspace of majority of European NATO member states. They were also training to transfer soldiers from the US through the territory of Europe to the Russian borders. In 2025, the intensity of the military preparation of NATO keeps up. The major exercises took place on the territory of Bulgaria and Romania, January 13, February 26, Norway, February 4 to 8 in the Mediterranean, March 3 to 14th. There's plan to have exercises in the Baltic states and Poland in April and June, and in the Arctic region. They train scenarios of numerous national and international exercises are focused around the potential confrontation with our country. NATO did not give Europe any added value in terms of stability and security. On the contrary, its geopolitical expansion eastwards led to a military conflict and destruction of architecture of European security. NATO's confrontation with Russia and building up of their military potential create threats to security for us and the whole world. But the situation in Ukraine, provoked by NATO, led to tectonic shifts in economy, food security, information security. Countries, until now, cannot adequately respond to what was created with the hands of the Biden administration and implemented by the Kyiv regime. Let's see what's going on right now. What is going on the European continent in its western part? There's more risks of incidents that can turn into a direct military conflict with tragic consequences for Europe and the whole world. And all of it takes place amid rewriting history with a very high rate and the start of a full-fledged anti-Russian neo-Nazi ideology, as like this genie is consciously is out of the bottle. The NATO imposed the militarization and new dividing lines. This does not contribute to security in Europe. This is to the issue of the topic that we are called aggressors in the Western media. I gave facts of those who indeed militarize and have destructive aims. We talked about Finland. There were a lot of questions. Russia for decades built relations with this country and with population based on mutual respect, pragmatic cooperation. There was political dialogue, trade, cultural exchanges, joint projects in energy and logistics, cross-border trips, millions of them. A lot of families were created, and all of that seems to be a solid foundation of good neighboring. And we had everything for peace and mutual understanding. I remember how former President Niinistö praised, I quote, direct and clear dialogue with Russia, and said that there are no problems in the relations, and we did not have from our side. However, after the start of the special military operation, and Helsinki knows that, was a response to the project provoked by the West to exterminate everything Russian and Russian-speaking people on the territory of Ukraine. After that, Helsinki turned into a mouthpiece of anti-Russian, Russophobe campaign. Mr. Niinistö, who once talked about mutually beneficial cooperation, started to talk, I quote, military crimes, aggression, loss of confidence. It turned out that all the good neighboring for the Finnish elite was a forced smile. They ostensibly tolerated the dangerous neighbor because of geography. The new president, Alexander Stubb, a passionate Atlantist, continued this performance. He threatened, quote, support Ukraine until victory. I cannot really tell anything else. He probably talked about the victory of Russia, but he cannot say that directly. He praised Finnish volunteers who went to fight against Russia, or suddenly he says that the Finnish people should morally prepare to restore relations with Russia. Probably the stance of President Stubb was influenced by a game of golf in Mar-a-Lago. In an interview to the Finnish magazine, after the journalist asked to clear the position of Helsinki about the prospects of relations with Moscow, Stubb said that something can be built only peace in Ukraine is settled. But when are they going to start citing Zelensky, who says that he's not going to establish any kind of peace? He's not planning any peaceful process. But Stubb did not talk about it to the Finnish people, but he said that the bilateral relations will never go back to the way they used to be, and accused Russia, you won't believe it, to imperialism that is inherent to it at the gene level. I didn't know that Mr. Stubb, a specialist in genetics, but if he isn't, then he should remember that all those who in the Western Europe talked about it there without special education ended up badly. President of Finland stopped seeing the future of relations with Russia and even doubted the relevance of the bilateral economic cooperation, not because of the European sanctions, but because the economy of Russia, I quote, very small. I would like President Stubb to talk about the size of the economy of the Baltic states, for example, or about the latest news about the economy of Germany and France. What's going on with the economy of Portugal, for example? Where's the logic? You're talking about the language of force, or it's time to restore the relations, or the relations will never be the same. This is not the politics, it's patchwork of populism and the fear before your own voters. Such inconsistency and self-contradictory of the actions of the Finnish leadership in terms of Russia leads to consequences. It is clear that because of the destruction of mutual beneficial cooperation with our country, Finland lost much more than it gained, if it gained anything at all. Security of Finland following after it joined NATO hardly strengthened. On the contrary, the finance burden increased. There's an atmosphere of military psychosis. After severing ties with economic ties with Russia, the Finnish people continue to suffer multi-billion losses. And this list of the results of the anti-Russian policy of the current Finnish leadership can go on. The irony is that the Finnish authorities recognize on their own there's little left from the earlier relations. Instead of analyzing their own mistakes, they continue to blame Russia. It's very convenient, and they receive money for this, probably. But this begs the question, who benefits from turning Finland into a base of confrontation? The clear is clear. It's to NATO. I talked about it. It is beneficial to those who benefit financially from somebody else's conflicts. Russia. To those who, despite the lessons of history, continues to exploit their superiority. Now about our country. Russia has always been prepared for a dialogue and demonstrated in practical steps this. The dialogue begs for sincerity, non-double standards and provocations. And until the Finnish leadership demonstrates weakness, the only one thing, the weakness in defending their own national interest, it is said that ordinary Finnish people are going to pay for this.
The Japanese militarism, we constantly keep you informed about the facts of crimes for this shameful act in the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory. We have new information on the subject of crimes of Japanese militarism during the Second World War, which, according to most, and as we have repeatedly emphasized, has no statute of limitations. Proceedings to punish all those responsible